Welcome back to Data and Context. I'm Allie Barefoot with Cotality. When we think of climate risk exposure in the property market, our minds tend to go to catastrophic visuals. But there's a silent creeping peril that is quietly becoming the single leading cause of weather-related fatalities and driving massive financial strain across the country: extreme heat. And we're looking beyond just those hot summer days, as Cotality data shows projected spikes in average annual losses up to 700% in areas that have historically been unprepared to handle these conditions. So, to help us look at this from a real estate and infrastructure perspective, we're going to be talking with Cotality's chief scientist, Howard Botts. Let's put the data into context. Welcome back to Data and Context, Howard. So happy to have you here.
Well, thank you, Allie. Always excited to be on with you.
Of course, and I feel like this is very timely as we are now officially in the start of summer of 2026. And we're going to be talking a little bit about climate risk exposure and heat. So I want to start with the baseline because when people read headlines about record-breaking temperatures, they assume it's business as usual in places in the American Southwest. You think of your Texas, your Arizona, really naturally hot states. But Cotality's data indicates that the threat is moving. Where are these dangerous increases in heat actually taking place?
Well, you're absolutely right, Allie, that the Southwest continues to lead in extreme heat days, but our models show the fastest acceleration of high heat and extreme heat days is happening in the upper Midwest and really the northeastern area. And these northern states, not unlike what Europe and other parts of the country are seeing, have experienced historically relatively cooler temperatures and often lack the cooling infrastructure. So, at Cotality, we're very acutely aware of infrastructure, what that means, and impacts on particularly these areas.
And this is kind of a massive paradigm shift for the Northeast, Howard. And so, what makes this particularly volatile is that people are actively moving into some of these transitioning areas, right? So, what does the demographic data tell us here about the migration, at least?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're seeing changes we haven't seen in 35 years with the Midwest and other areas gaining in population, significant in-migration to Pittsburgh or Cincinnati, Milwaukee, Chicago, other areas. And this really shift to places like those are really being driven by affordability issues, by relatively climate issues. And although we're seeing, increased heat trends in this area relative to the South, they're still better off, even though they will be increasing in heat in time. So, it's an area where people are moving, but perhaps aren't aware of future heat risks and maybe purchasing homes in which they're really not aware of the need for air conditioning or additional maybe retrofitting.
Right. So a migration strategy to escape the heat could actually land you right in the middle of this shifting risk zone. So now, even with the Northeast warming rapidly, the traditional heavyweights, they're not losing their titles. We talked about that, Howard. You think of the Texas, you think of the Arizonas. What is happening in the absolute hottest tier of the country?
Arizona definitely continuing to lead in terms of heat. Maricopa County, for instance, our data indicates that heat will spike an estimated 30 to 50% over by 2050. And major economic hubs, across the region, including Texas, will see significant increases in heat. And all of that is going to drive, soaring utility costs, grid strain, and a variety of other additional costs for homeowners.
Let's look past the national averages and look directly at the localized economic impact. When these heat waves settle in, they don't just cause discomfort, they carry a pretty heavy dollar amount as well. So, can you kind of break down for us the financial strain at the local level that this causes?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right perspective to take, Allie. These extreme heat is much more than a comfort issue and is, like you said, creating tremendous economic strain. And at Cotality, we have very granular data where we're looking at individual structures, and we kind of see it breaking down extreme heat into certainly a clear public health vulnerability, uh, but also financial impacts to property and infrastructure. And if we look forward to 2050, we were talking about Arizona a minute ago, they're going to have four of the five hottest counties in the U.S. Yuma, La Paz, Maricopa, and Pinal counties. So, we've seen a shifting really climate baselines with significantly more heat days. Maricopa County, where Phoenix is, we anticipate a 39% increase in extreme heat days by 2050. And last year alone, this shouldn't be a surprise that it's getting hotter. They had 113 days straight that were over 110 degrees. So all of this has a substantial human impact. We're seeing heat-related fatalities in Arizona at double the rate of Texas, which has, you know, uh, Arizona has one-sixth of the population. And while this is sobering, I think it's a really a call for us to start looking at forward-looking modeling. Our cities today are really designed for the 1950s or 60s. And we're, as you mentioned earlier, a new paradigm of increasing heat, increasing humidity, and all of that is going to have substantial impact on as we build forward in the future.
Yeah, you can definitely see in the data that it's moving beyond just the financial sheets and it's really starting to impact health. And I think that, any homeowner, a home is just a building, but your health, your family, that's what really matters here. And you kind of touched on it there, how we're talking about how we need to continue looking at forward looking models. So, how do we move from this reactive holding pattern that true climate resilience in the face of extreme heat gives us? What does the data tell property developers, insurers, and local governments to kind of do next to prepare for the next 5, 10 years of this extreme heat coming in?
Yeah, you've absolutely capitalized on it. And I think what we're talking about here is not to generate fear, but to really talk about what can we do to make our homes and property and other things more adaptive. Certainly, property builders will need to focus really on resilience and not building, as we talked about, for today's averages, but for the future. You think of, again, if we go back to the Midwest and Northeast, many of the homes don't have air conditioning and or substantial insulation and protection against heat. So developers will need to start looking at building more resilient and smarter communities, but also need for retrofitting. And a lot of end users are looking at our models and saying, hey, I've got a senior living facility. What do I need to do? What kinds of remediation can I make to this property? Certainly, insurers, it has a major impact. We haven't really talked about ancillary things related to heat, but obviously wildfire, particularly across the southern tier of states, and even places like Florida and others we don't think about are becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And that definitely will continue to drive insurance costs, both in terms of direct losses and replacement costs. And then I think local governments need to stop thinking about heat as a liability, but to start thinking about it as a way that they can redevelop the community or mitigate different aspects. One of the things that often surprises me, we do a lot of look at local communities, and you can find some areas of the city that are 15, 20 degrees warmer than others. And a lot of that has to do with tree cover, vegetation, park space. And One of the things we've seen rapidly that I don't think people think a lot about is things like artificial turf.
Mm.
We're seeing a number of lawsuits in various cities across the South where the temperature can be 80 degrees out, but the actual artificial turf can be 140, 160 degrees. So, cities need to think about this. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of reemphasis about planting trees, creating more shade, other kinds of things. So, perhaps a long answer to your question, but it really is a multi-part thing. We need to have developers thinking about the future. We need to have insurers looking at how they can help homeowners mitigate risk. And we need to have communities building for the future, which will make them much more attractive.
Yeah, I really like what you said about how this data is not to instill fear, but rather help communities prepare for what is coming and get ahead of it while we do still have time, which you gave some great examples of mitigation efforts there. So thank you so much, Howard, for shedding more light on this for us. On Cotality's Insights page, you were a big helping hand in our piece, feeling the heat. So that gave us a little bit more numbers on paper, but having your insights is always, always really appreciated, Howard. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allie. It's always a pleasure to be on with you.
Thank you again to Howard Botts for joining us here on Data and Context, and thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, subscribe to Cotality's YouTube channel, and as always, if you want to find out more information, head on over to cotality.com.